Good afternoon, guys. This is Henry Gamble with SimplerOptions.com, and in today's free video, I wanted to drill down a little bit more into metals. We've been covering gold quite a bit, as it has been a very active and moving market. Today's video, I wanted to cover a little bit more on the topic of its correlation with the dollar. Now, when you talk about correlations, there's a lot of times where these will kind of break apart and they'll come back together, and maybe they trade very closely to each other and then they'll be apart from each other for a bit. But knowing kind of where you stand in that can be very helpful. Now, when I think about how an underlying might be correlated to another, like in the case of dollar and gold, I'm not going to look at something like a 5-minute chart. While you may find some relevant correlations between those, I think the best places to start are, at least the daily, and maybe you could make some arguments for the 4-hour charts, but primarily you want to look at your bigger time frames. Now, another thing that's interesting about this, and you'll have to bear with me on basically as I go through and explain this, but what most people will do is they'll come down, and this is from Thinkorswim, of course, but if you go down into studies and add a study, at the very bottom you'll have the opportunity to compare this to a symbol. Now I'm going to use a custom symbol and use the futures for the dollar. And when you look at this, people are trying to think, okay, if dollar has an inverse relationship to gold, that means I should be able to see areas where these pivot. Essentially, gold makes a low at the same time that the dollar makes a high, and so on and so forth. Here's another good example of that. But that's not always easy to see with these inverse correlations. So if the dollar is supposed to be the inverse of gold, what you can do to make these a little bit closer for your tracking is just look at the inverse of gold. So you throw a minus sign in front of the /GC and then hit enter. And then suddenly this seems to make a lot more sense, because now what you're looking for is that the prices actually stick right beside each other, and it shows you how closely correlated these assets have become. During this period back here, it was very general. Kind of threw off my drawing tool there, but you can see the idea where generally, yeah, it's kind of moving together, but it wasn't perfect. Then here in August, suddenly they're very closely correlated with each other, and now you can see how they've kind of been moving in lockstep. So just switching that and looking at the inverse of your underlying, which then will have a positive correlation to the dollar, I think can help you determine whether or not those are actually moving together like you would expect, and it's a little easier than trying to find the inverse sometimes. Now, the other market that I wanted to take a look at was silver, because the big discussion that we had been having today is essentially, we talked about price targets in gold. What about some price targets in silver? And when you come back and take a look at this pattern, the problem with the pattern that you got going on here is that it's already had a more significant move to the downside, but the main thing I was looking at here was this little bit of a wedge. This includes the low that was made at $18.17, and then the descending trend line that was made from the high shortly thereafter. So you kind of formulate this wedge pattern. Then what you want to do is adjust it to where you can have just where it makes it easier for you to draw on the chart. And then what I like to do, and this is much easier if you have drawing snapping enabled, let's go ahead and snap to that high and try to run this down to be as straight as we can, but then right down into that low. Once that is done, you've essentially measured that move, and what you can do then is right click and either duplicate, or in this case I'm just going to activate the drawing, which will allow me to move it, and then you want to measure that from the breakout point. So from the breakout there in relation to that move, and then you can grab your horizontal price tool, kind of mark it off there where those intersect, and that's going to show you a target right there around 1120. And the nice thing where gold had this confluence, let's see if silver does it as well. We'll come back to a monthly chart. But this is kind of what you're seeing, and it's very similar to what's going on with gold, where not only does that price projection make sense from the measured move that you saw here, but it also makes sense that when you get down into these lows here, that at the very least you'll run into some congestion and potentially an area for a bounce. So hopefully that helps with the metals analysis, gives you several things to follow for the months to come, and we'll be keeping tabs on that one as it unfolds. One other thing I wanted to make you guys aware of is a class that John is going to be putting on this Wednesday, November 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Of course, that's 7 if you're on Central Time here with us, anywhere near the Austin area or time zone. In this webinar, we're going to be discussing why to trade debit spreads. Now, this is obviously a little bit of a different situation exactly. I'm reminded of a trade that John took in BIDU just recently, and it's worked out really well in situations that you're looking for essentially a rally, but trying to find areas to optimize the sale of a spread to complement your entry. In this case, and for those of you that have been following us, it was a nice place shorting the 245 and being longer a further dated option, but it'll follow similar strategies, and it will also give you opportunities or information on how can I find setups where I'm bullish, but I don't have the risk of just an outright, straight up call option. And I think that's something that can really help people that are just getting into these strategies. So here's a few of the bullet points you can check out on that. Obviously, I always enjoy listening to John. I feel like I learn something every time he opens his mouth. But at any rate, if you guys want to join us for it, here's a page where you can sign up for that. You'll be redirected to it after this video, and I hope to see you there.